On Christmas night, as laughter echoed around the living room and the tree glowed with lights, my father raised his glass, smiled at my brother, and called him the heart of our family. Then he turned to me and said I was the black sheep. In that moment, I felt every sacrifice I had made, every mortgage payment, every medical bill, every secret check to cover my brother's mistakes, collapse into silence. That night I realized the family's so-called golden child was never its savior. He was its burden, and I was done carrying the weight alone. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old and I work as a senior financial analyst in downtown Chicago. On paper, my life looks polished. Salary condo with a view of the lake, a title I worked years to earn. But when I close my eyes, the voice that comes back isn't one from the boardroom. It's the voice of my father calling across a football field 20 years ago, shouting the name of his golden boy while I sat invisible in the bleachers. I grew up in Naperville, a quiet suburb with manicured lawns and neighbors who waved as they collected the morning paper. From the outside, my family looked like any other mom-dad. 2 kids. Sunday dinners, church on Easter. Inside, the story was different. My father Richard had only one star in his sky. My older brother Michael. He was the athlete, the charmer, the boy who could light up a room. Dad called him my golden boy so often that even the neighbors used the phrase, me. I was the girl with glasses nose buried in books, more comfortable at the library than the pep rally. When people asked about his kids, Dad would grin and say, "Michael the quarterback, you should see him play," while I stood there holding my honor roll certificate. At best, I was the smart one, said with a shrug, as though it mattered less than a touchdown. I remember Friday nights in high school like a pattern etched in stone. Dad would pull on Michael's jersey number 12 stretched tight across his chest and pace the sidelines shouting plays as if he were the coach. The crowd roared. Mom painted Michael's number on her cheek, and I sat in the bleachers with a book propped on my knees using the stadium lights to finish my AP assignments. During halftime, Dad would high-five Michael, and I would quietly unwrap a sandwich Mom had tossed into my backpack. It wasn't that I hated Michael. He was my brother, and sometimes he'd tousle my hair and call me Brainiac with a smile that almost felt kind. But the balance was never fair. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family barbecue revolved around him. My father never missed a chance to remind me that if I could just be more like Michael, life would be easier. For me and for them. One memory burns sharper than the rest. I was 12. Michael 15. Snow dusted the sidewalks. The smell of pine needles filled our living room and the tree glittered with ornaments collected over the years. That Christmas morning, Dad wheeled out a brand new BMX bike, shiny red with chrome handlebars. Michael's face lit up as if Santa himself had stepped into the room. The whole family clapped and Dad beamed like he'd just handed his son the world. When it was my turn, a smaller box appeared in my lap. I tore the paper carefully the way Mom had taught me to reveal a used copy of a novel I'd already borrowed twice from the library. "You love to read," Mom said gently, patting my shoulder. Dad was still circling the bike, showing Michael how to adjust the seat. I smiled, or at least I tried to. I thanked them, ran my fingers over the worn spine, and told myself it was enough. But inside, something cracked. Even on the one day meant to celebrate both of us equally, I was reminded that in this family I would never shine as bright as Michael's golden glow. That day ended with Dad taking Michael outside to ride the bike up and down our icy street while relatives stood on the porch cheering. I stayed inside, curled up on the couch with my second-hand book pretending to read while the laughter echoed through the cold air. I pressed my hand against the frosted window, watching my father jog beside Michael, pride radiating from him like a spotlight. Not once did he turn to see me watching. It was then at 12 years old that I understood a truth too heavy for a child. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried in my father's eyes, I would always be the extra, the background, the girl who didn't matter as much. Even in moments meant for family, I was the one left in the shadows. And that knowledge, sharp as broken glass, settled deep inside me, shaping the woman I would one day become. High school only made the divide wider. Michael walked the halls like a celebrity, his varsity jacket slung over his shoulder, teachers calling him by name, classmates hanging on his every word. Friday nights were sacred. The stands packed, the band playing loud as the announcer shouted, "Touchdown! Carter!" I watched from the bleachers, my textbooks balanced on my lap, the roar of the crowd swallowing the quiet pride I felt for my own accomplishments. At home, Dad would beam. "Michael's got a golden heart. He told our neighbors everyone loves him." I stood nearby the honor roll certificate folded in my hands, my throat tight. He never said those words about me. The year I won a statewide academic competition, Mom and Dad showed up to the auditorium in Springfield. I remember gripping the heavy glass trophy, the stage lights hot on my face as I searched for their smiles. They clapped politely, snapped a couple of pictures, and then whispered about needing to leave early. "Your brother's game starts in an hour," Dad said as he ushered Mom toward the exit. I rode home in the back seat, the trophy resting beside me while they talked strategy for Michael's match. Even at family dinners, the conversation always circled back to him. Aunt Helen leaned forward once, laughing. Michael could charm the stripes off a tiger. Dad raised his glass. "That's my boy. He's the kind of man who makes people feel special." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. No one asked me about the advanced placement classes I was juggling, the scholarship letters starting to arrive in the mail. Graduation night should have been mine. I was valedictorian, chosen to deliver the speech I had spent weeks perfecting. I wanted to talk about perseverance, about carving your own path when the world expected you to follow someone else's. Standing at the podium, I looked out into the crowd. The rows of families, blurred faces lit by the glow of cell phones. In the section reserved for my relatives, cousins, whispered Mom scrolled through her camera roll, and Dad stared at the program as if counting the minutes until Michael's name was called. I spoke anyway, voice, steady, my words carrying into the gymnasium. "Success isn't measured by applause," I said, "but by the quiet work done when no one is watching." I might as well have been invisible. When I finished, there was polite clapping, a few nods, the rustle of programs closing. 20 minutes later, they called Michael's name. He wasn't an honors student, not the captain of anything, just another graduate in a line of hundreds. But when he crossed the stage, my entire family leapt to their feet. Dad cupped his hands around his mouth, whistling so loud the row in front turned to look. "That's my son," he shouted, his voice echoing in the rafters. I stood at the edge of the stage, still holding the folder that contained my speech. My chest felt tight, my ears ringing with the cheers that hadn't been for me. Michael grinned, lifting his diploma high, and the gym thundered with applause. I smiled faintly, my lips stiff, and stepped aside. That night back home, relatives swarmed Michael, clapping him on the back, telling him he was destined for greatness. I slipped into the kitchen, setting my speech notes on the counter, the words meaningless now. Mom followed me in, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You did well, honey," she said absent-mindedly, already glancing toward the living room where Michael's laughter carried over the hum of voices. I whispered a thank you, but the ache in my chest deepened. I had climbed every mountain set in front of me, but somehow it was never tall enough to be seen. It was in that moment, standing alone with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, that I understood the truth in this family celebration. In every celebration, I would always be the outsider looking in. When it came time to apply to college, the truth was obvious even before the acceptance letters arrived. Michael's tuition was the family's priority, and I was expected to be practical. My father sat me down at the kitchen table, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. "Community college is a smart choice for you, Emily," he said, tapping his finger on the table as though it were final. "It's affordable, and you'll get your basics done. Save us all a little stress. Save us all a little stress." What he meant was there wasn't money for both of us, and Michael's dreams came first. So, while my brother moved into a dorm at the University of Illinois with a brand new laptop and a mini fridge, Dad proudly loaded into the trunk I enrolled at Harper College in Palatine. My orientation packet came with a part-time job application for the library, which I filled out that same day. Those first months felt like walking a tightrope. I worked shifts shelving books, the smell of old paper clinging to my hands, then studied late into the night. Every paycheck was rationed carefully. Gas textbooks, a little left over for groceries. I learned how to stretch $10 into a week of meals, ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, apples from the discount bin. I told myself it was temporary, that hard work would open doors. Meanwhile, Michael posted photos of himself at fraternity parties, his arms slung around friends, red Solo cups raised high. His captions dripped with confidence. "Living the dream," Dad shared them proudly with neighbors. "My boy's going to be an engineer," he bragged, puffing his chest out. I overheard him once in the yard telling Mr. Green next door, "Michael's got such potential. He's going places." No one asked me how many hours I worked to afford my calculus book. No one cared that I was tutoring other students at night just to keep the lights on in my tiny apartment. Still, I pushed forward. After 2 years at Harper, I earned enough scholarships to transfer to the University of Illinois myself. Moving onto that campus felt like stepping into a new world. The lecture halls were massive, the professors demanding, but I thrived. Numbers made sense in a way people didn't. I could dissect a balance sheet and see a story hidden inside. For once, I felt like I belonged to something bigger than my family's small circle of judgment. Graduation in 2014 was my proudest moment. I wore my cap and gown, my honors cords draped heavy on my shoulders. As I walked across the stage, I looked for my parents. Mom smiled and clapped politely. Dad glanced at his watch. Michael wasn't there. He'd switched majors again and was still dragging himself through classes. I told myself it didn't matter, but the emptiness gnawed. That summer, I landed an internship at a financial firm in downtown Chicago. The skyline felt like Freedom Glass Towers rising above Lake Michigan. I worked late, shadowed senior analysts, learned how markets moved, and people panicked. For the first time, my effort was rewarded with respect. At the office, they called me sharp, reliable. At home, I was still invisible. Michael's path was unraveling. By then, he had changed majors 3 times, engineering, communications, business. And his GPA was hanging by a thread. Still, Dad excused it. "He's figuring himself out," he told relatives. College is about finding your passion. The same grace was never extended to me. Then one evening, Mom called. Her voice was tight. "Emily, honey, we're in a bind." "Your dad's card." "Well, there's a balance we can't cover this month, just until things settle." I didn't ask questions. I wired $500 from my internship paycheck money I'd been saving for a deposit on a better apartment. A week later at a family barbecue, I overheard Dad boasting. "Michael's really stepped up," he said proudly, flipping burgers on the grill. "Handled the bills this month, showed real maturity." My stomach clenched. I opened my mouth ready to correct him, but the words died on my tongue. I watched Michael accept the praise with a careless smile, nodding as though it were true. That night I lay awake in my tiny studio, the roar of the L train rattling the windows. I thought about how easily my sacrifice had been erased, how quickly my effort had been rewritten into Michael's legend. It wasn't just invisibility anymore, it was erasure. My work, my sweat, my dollars, turned into proof of his supposed growth. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I felt something cold settle in my chest. If they could take my hard-earned help and give the credit to him, then what did that make me in their story? Not just the outsider, not even the forgotten daughter. I was the background, the invisible scaffolding propping up the golden child. And for the first time, I began to wonder how much more of myself I was willing to lose just to keep the illusion alive. By 2018, the cracks in my father's business were too wide to hide. Carter Builders, the company he had clung to for decades, collapsed after a major client went bankrupt, leaving him with unpaid invoices and more than $45,000 in tax debt. The man who once strutted through the neighborhood boasting about his contracts now sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, bills spread out like a losing hand of cards. Mom tried to sound calm when she called me, but her voice shook. "Emily, honey, we're behind on the mortgage. The bank's been calling. Your dad's too proud to ask, but if we don't catch up, we could lose the house." I looked around my apartment in Chicago at the modest couch I'd bought secondhand and the stack of bills waiting on my own counter. I had been saving $5,000 for a down payment on a better place, something with one extra room and maybe a balcony. Instead, I wired every penny to them that night. A week later at a family gathering, I heard my father's booming voice. It was tough, but I managed to work things out. Kept the bank off our backs. He slapped his chest, pride restored. My relatives clapped him on the shoulder, congratulating him on his resilience. I stood in the corner, my wine glass trembling in my hand, invisible as ever. Michael by then had dropped out of college. He drifted back into his old bedroom like nothing had changed, leaving clothes in piles on the floor, game controllers tangled in cords, empty soda cans stacked on his desk. He slept until noon, played video games until dawn, and claimed he was taking time to figure things out. When I visited one weekend, the house felt heavy with silence. The fridge hummed nearly empty except for a jar of mustard and a carton of milk about to expire. Yet Michael cracked open a beer in front of me, leaned back on the couch, and turned the volume up on his music. "You working these days?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, eyes still on the screen. "Networking? Something will come up." Something would come up. If I kept covering the bills, if Dad kept shielding him, if the world kept bending to fit his excuses. Later that afternoon, I stood in the yard while Dad talked to Mr. Green, Mr. Green, the same neighbor he'd bragged to for years. "This is my son Michael," he said, clapping him on the back as Michael shuffled outside. "Golden child of this family, he's going to help us turn things around." Michael barely muttered a hello, retreating back inside with his beer, but Dad didn't seem to notice. His eyes glowed with the same blinding pride he'd carried since high school football games. I stood there a few feet away, my stomach knotting. Golden child. Savior. The words rang hollow in the cold evening air. I had just sacrificed $5,000 I'd scraped together with years of discipline, and yet here was my father propping up a son who had given nothing back. That night, lying awake in my old bed, the peeling wallpaper surrounding me like a reminder of every childhood slight, I let a dangerous thought slip into my mind. What if I stopped? What if I pulled back my money, my effort, my quiet rescues? Would they even make it through a month without me? The question lodged itself deep, sharp, and unyielding. It was the first time I allowed myself to wonder if my absence would reveal the truth my father refused to see, that his golden child wasn't carrying this family. Michael met Sarah Miller at a friend's barbecue the summer after he'd moved back home. She was a familiar face from high school, the kind of girl everyone remembered as sweet and dependable. Within a few months, they were inseparable, and by the end of 2018, he announced their engagement over dinner, like he was unveiling a crown jewel. Dad practically leapt out of his chair. "This is it. This is the new start we've all been waiting for," he declared, pounding the table as if the words themselves could change our reality. Plans began immediately. What started as a modest $10,000 wedding quickly ballooned. Sarah wanted the ballroom at a hotel in Oak Brook, the kind with chandeliers and white glove service. Michael insisted on an open bar and a live band. Every conversation added another $1,000 to the bill. By spring, the total had climbed to $25,000. I kept quiet at first, hoping they would rein things in, but then Mom called one evening. "Emily, sweetheart, we're in over our heads. Your brother deserves a proper wedding. Could you help with some of the expenses help meant cover?" I transferred $12,000 over the next few weeks. Checks for the florist, deposits for the photographer. The balance on the reception hall. I watched my savings vanish, the condo I had been dreaming of slipping further away. On the wedding day, the ballroom glittered with fairy lights, tables draped in ivory linen. Sarah walked down the aisle radiant, Michael grinning like he had already won the lottery. Guests whispered about how beautiful everything was, how lucky Sarah was to marry into such a strong family. I bit down on my smile, my hands folded tight around the bouquet I had been asked to carry. During the reception, Dad stood and raised his glass high. "Michael," he said, his voice thick with pride, "you are the light of this family, the future, our strength." The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinking. Not a single word for me, the sister who had paid for nearly half the evening. I sat back in my chair, the applause crashing in my ears. The band struck up a lively tune, and Michael pulled Sarah onto the dance floor, their laughter echoing through the room. Around me, relatives toasted cameras, flashed plates of prime rib, and champagne flowed as if money grew on trees. Later, as Sarah slipped her hand into Michael's and announced she was pregnant, the room exploded with joy. "He'll be a wonderful father," Aunt Helen gushed. "A real man of the family," Dad added, beaming. I forced a smile, hugged them both, whispered congratulations. Inside, a sour ache spread through me. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching my brother bask in the glow of attention, his arm around his glowing bride, the crowd encircling them with cheers. The music swelled. Lights twinkled off the crystal glasses. Laughter filled the air. And I realized that in this glittering room full of celebration and promises of the future, I was once again only a shadow. The call came at 2:14 in the morning. My phone buzzed across the nightstand, the screen lighting up with Dad's name. I answered groggily, already bracing myself. "Emily," he said, his voice strained but commanding. "It's Michael. He's been arrested. DUI. We need you to cover the lawyer. Right now." I sat up, my chest tightening. "What?" He was drinking and driving. "Dad, cut me off. This isn't the time for judgment. He needs help. A good attorney can make this go away. It'll be about 8,000. 8,000? The number hit me like a slap. That was my emergency fund, months of careful saving. I pressed my forehead into my palms, staring at the glow of the Chicago skyline outside my window. "Dad, I can't keep." "You can?" he snapped. His tone softened a beat later. "Please, he's your brother. We can't let this ruin his future." I wired the money before dawn, the transfer confirmation burning on my laptop screen. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the back of a county courtroom in DuPage. The air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Michael shuffled in wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. The judge read the charges, driving under the influence, reckless endangerment. Michael's attorney stood beside him, polished and confident, the kind you pay top dollar for. I clenched my fists in my lap, knowing exactly where that polish had come from. My bank account. When the sentence came down, my stomach dropped. 1-year license suspension, 12 months of probation, a hefty fine. The words rang out like a bell tolling. Dad was quick to spin it. As the family gathered outside the courthouse, his arm draped around Michael's shoulders, he said with a forced chuckle, "Just a stumble, that's all. My boy will get back on track. He's still my golden child." I stared at them, my mouth dry. Michael couldn't even look at me, his gaze fixed on the concrete. That's when Uncle George stepped closer. He had retired from the police force years earlier, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a man who had seen too many lives unravel. He leaned toward me, his voice low and firm. "You've been bailing him out too long, Emily. He's never going to stand if you keep being his crutch." The words landed heavier than the judge's gavel. I looked at my brother. 29 years old, married, soon to be a father, shaking like a teenager caught sneaking out, and my father puffing up his chest, insisting that nothing had changed. But something had changed. For me. In that sterile courtroom surrounded by murmurs and shuffling papers, I saw the truth with brutal clarity. Michael wasn't just draining me of money. He was a danger reckless enough to put lives at risk, and my father's denial only made it worse. I walked out into the cold March air, my coat pulled tight around me, my heels clicking against the concrete steps. Snow flurries swirled in the wind. behind me I could hear Dad's booming voice telling a cousin on the phone, "He'll be fine. Just needs time." I kept walking, my heart pounding with the realization I could no longer ignore. Michael wasn't a victim of bad luck. He was a problem no one wanted to face. And somehow I had become the one paying for all of it. By 2020, I had lost count of how many times I had opened my checkbook or logged into my online banking just to make someone else's problem disappear. The numbers, though, were impossible to ignore. $15,000 toward the mortgage when the bank threatened foreclosure. $10,000 for Mom's surgery and follow-up treatments. $12,000 for Michael's overblown wedding. $8,000 for his DUI lawyer. Another $20,000 sprinkled across utility bills, groceries, car repairs, and whatever else came up when someone dialed my number late at night. $65,000. I wrote it down in my journal one evening, the ink smudging as my hand trembled. It was nearly the same as a down payment for a condo in Chicago, the one I had been saving for since my first day at the firm. Instead of building my own future, I was keeping theirs afloat. I remember signing a check for the electric bill, the paper smooth under my hand. I signed my name so many times it felt like I was disappearing into the loops of my own signature. Then I looked at my savings account, emptier than it had been in years. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. One night we were supposed to go out for dinner, but I canceled, telling him I needed to catch up on work. The truth was, I had just wired another $1,000 to cover Mom's dental work. When I finally showed up at his apartment, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and frustration. They don't see you as their daughter anymore," he said quietly. "You're just the ATM they hit when things get rough." I bristled. "It's not that simple. They're my family." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Exactly. Family should love you, not use you." His words stayed with me louder than Dad's phone calls, sharper than Michael's casual requests. That night I pulled out my journal and wrote at the top of the page, "Bank of Emily." Underneath, I listed every payment, every wire transfer, every check. As the list grew, so did the rage curling in my stomach. Bank of Emily. That was what I had become. No interest earned, no appreciation, given just endless withdrawals until I had nothing left. One Saturday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, the sun slanting across the hardwood floors, highlighting the neat stack of receipts and bank statements spread before me. I ran the numbers twice, then a third time, hoping I'd made a mistake. But each total landed on the same sickening truth: $65,000. I closed my eyes and imagined the condo listings I had been scrolling through a year earlier. 2-bedroom units with balconies overlooking the lake kitchens with marble counters, places I could have called mine. Instead, I was stuck in a modest 1-bedroom rental, pouring my future into a family that barely noticed. Still, when the phone rang again, Dad's voice thick with apology, Michael's voice laced with charm. I picked up. I transferred the money. I reassured them it was fine. And yet, as I pressed confirm on the transfer, a thought gnawed at me louder than ever before. I wasn't just sacrificing for them. I was being bled dry piece by piece, and if I didn't stop, there wouldn't be anything left of me to save. The journal sat open on the table, the words Bank of Emily scrawled across the top of the page, staring back at me like a brand I couldn't erase. By the spring of 2021, the cracks in Michael's marriage split wide open. Sarah had had enough. Enough of the empty promises, the drinking, the late nights when he stumbled home smelling like a bar floor. One afternoon, Mom called me, her voice trembling. "Sarah's gone," she said. She packed up and left him. She didn't take Jacob. She said she couldn't do it anymore. Jacob was 6 years old. He still had baby fat in his cheeks and eyes too wide for his little face. The thought of him left behind with my brother, jobless, half-drunk most days, made my stomach twist. I drove out to Naperville that weekend. The house looked the same from the outside, but inside it reeked of stale beer and neglect. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy and cold. Jacob sat curled on the couch in a blanket too thin for the draft slipping under the windows. His small hands clutched the edge of the fabric like it was armor. "Hi, buddy," I whispered, kneeling in front of him. His eyes met mine, tired and red-rimmed. "Daddy's sleeping," he said softly. I glanced toward the hallway. Michael was sprawled across his bedshoes, still on an empty bottle at his feet. He snored unevenly, oblivious. I turned back to Jacob, pulling him gently into my arms. His little body trembled as he pressed against me, and I could feel the cold seeping through his pajamas. "You're safe," I murmured, brushing his hair back. "I've got you." In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed with emptiness. Half a bottle of ketchup, a jar of pickles, nothing else. I heated water, found a packet of oatmeal at the back of a cupboard, and stirred it slowly, my hands shaking with anger. How had it come to this? Dad arrived later that evening, whistling as though nothing were wrong. He ruffled Jacob's hair, kissed Mom on the cheek, then clapped Michael on the back when he finally staggered awake. "He just needs a new start," Dad said, his voice warm with conviction. "Michael's got so much potential. He's still our golden child." I stared at him, words choking in my throat. Golden child. Potential. Those were the phrases he had used my whole life, the shield that excused everything. Michael wasn't a child anymore. He was a grown man who had just lost his wife and was now neglecting his son. Jacob clung to my hand, hiding half behind my leg as Dad praised Michael. My heart cracked fury, mingling with grief. I wanted to scream, to shake Dad until he saw what I saw, a boy suffering in silence, a man wasting every chance he had been given. Instead, I tucked Jacob into bed, sitting on the edge of the mattress until his breathing evened out. The nightlight cast a soft glow on his face, and I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me. In that moment, I knew something I hadn't dared admit before. My father's golden child wasn't a gift to this family. He was its burden, dragging everyone else under while Dad kept applauding from the sidelines. As I stood in the dark hallway, Jacob's tiny snores filling the silence, I clenched my fists. A vow formed in my chest, sharp and unshakable. One day I would stop being silent. One day I would make them see the truth. Christmas of 2023 should have been warm, filled with laughter, the kind of evening where families bury old grudges under wrapping paper and holiday lights. The living room in my parents' house glowed with strands of colored bulbs, the tree draped in ornaments collected through decades, gifts piled high around the base. The smell of cinnamon and roasted ham drifted from the kitchen, and relatives crowded the couches, balancing plates of pie and coffee cups. I sat in the corner, Jacob leaning against me, his small hands twisting the ribbon from one of his presents. Michael was back on the sofa, half presentable for once in a pressed shirt, though his eyes still carried the faint glaze I had learned to recognize. He grinned, soaking in every word of encouragement from the relatives surrounding him. Dad stood near the tree, glass of red wine in hand, commanding the room as if it were his pulpit. "Let's take a moment," he said, clearing his throat, to celebrate what really matters this year. His gaze swept the room until it landed on Michael. "This young man here, he's the heart of our family. He's caring, he's resilient, and he's the reason we can look forward with hope." Applause broke out, uneven but loud enough. A few cousins clapped, Aunt Helen dabbed at her eyes, and Uncle George nodded stiffly. My chest tightened as Jacob shifted closer to me, as if sensing the storm gathering. Then Dad turned his eyes sharp, his smile fading into something colder. He lifted his glass slightly in my direction. "And Emily," he said, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fireplace. "Our black sheep, always off on her own, focused on money instead of family. Different from the rest of us." The words sliced through the room. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced at their shoes. Someone gave a nervous chuckle, but the silence that followed was deafening. My ears rang. My face hot, every muscle in my body screaming to either run or scream. I didn't move. Not right away. I am Satan, frozen. Jacob's small weight anchoring me to the couch, the taste of bitterness rising in my throat. I had endured years of quiet slights, of being invisible, of watching my contributions erased. But this This was public humiliation delivered under twinkling lights in front of everyone I shared blood with. Something in me snapped. Slowly, deliberately, I set Jacob aside and stood. My knees barely trembled. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and unlocked the banking app with a swipe of my thumb. The glow lit my face, steady and cold. "Mortgage payment," I said evenly, my voice cutting through the hush. September 2018. $5,000. The room stilled. Dad's smile faltered, the glass in his hand lowering by an inch. Mom's lips parted as though to protest, but no sound came. I scrolled. Car repair for Dad's truck, January 2019, $1,200. Medical bills for Mom's surgery, April 2020, $10,000. Each number landed like a hammer on stone. Cousin Jennifer leaned forward, her brows knitting. Uncle George shifted in his chair, crossing his arms. I raised my eyes from the screen and let them sweep the room. While you've all been told I only care about money, I've been the one keeping this family's lights on. I've been the one making sure this house didn't get taken by the bank. I've been the one paying for the celebrations you toasted. No one spoke. Even Jacob's fidgeting stilled, his wide eyes fixed on me. Dad tried to laugh, though it cracked halfway out of his throat. "Emily, this isn't the time. You made it the time," I said, my voice sharper now. "You stood here in front of everyone and called me the black sheep. So let's be honest, Dad. Let's talk about who's really been carrying this family." The silence pressed heavy on my chest, but I didn't waver. The glow of the Christmas tree flickered across stunned faces, and in that moment I knew there was no going back. Medical bills. I continued scrolling through my phone, my voice sharp enough to slice through the stunned silence. April 2020. $10,000 for Mom's surgery. Wedding expenses, $12,000. DUI attorney, $8,000. Utility bills, groceries, car payments over the years, at least $20,000. The numbers echoed like verdicts. I lifted my gaze to my father. "And you have the nerve to stand here in front of everyone and call me the black sheep." My voice cracked with fury, but it was steady. "I am the one who kept this roof over your heads. Without me, you'd have lost this house years ago. Without me, your golden child wouldn't have made it through his wedding, his arrest, or his latest round of excuses." Michael sat hunched on the couch, his face, crimson eyes glued to the floor. His hands twisted together, the swagger stripped clean away. Dad's face drained of color, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around his wine glass. Mom's sobs broke the stillness, her hand pressed against her mouth as if she could somehow swallow the truth spilling across the room. "You want to call me selfish?" I spat, stepping forward, my phone still glowing in my hand. "You want to paint me as cold, money-obsessed, every cent I poured into this family was out of love. And you," I jabbed a finger toward Michael, "have done nothing but take. You're not the heart of this family. You're the burden crushing it." Gasps rippled through the room. Aunt Helen whispered something to Uncle George, who shook his head slowly, disbelief etched on his face. Cousin Jennifer set her coffee cup down hard on the table, her eyes darting between me and my father. Dad tried to muster his old authority, his voice rising. "Enough, Emily. You don't humiliate your family like this." "No, Dad." I cut him off, my words fierce. "You did that the moment you called me a black sheep in front of everyone. You humiliated me while I was still paying your bills. You celebrated Michael while I was emptying my savings account. Don't you dare tell me about humiliation." The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the void between us. Michael shifted, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. His shame hung in the air, thick and choking. Mom finally whispered, "Emily, please, not like this." I turned to her, the ache in my chest sharp but unrelenting. "You think I enjoy this? Do you know what it's like to sign away your future month after month? While being told you don't understand family, I have spent years being your safety net. And what has it gotten me? A label. Black sheep." For a long moment, no one moved. The tree lights blinked merrily behind us, mocking the devastation unraveling in the room. I slipped my phone into my bag, reached for my coat draped over the back of a chair, and pulled it on. My voice was calm now, eerily steady. The Bank of Emily is officially closed. From this day forward, you take care of yourselves. Gasps broke out again, a cousin muttering, "I can't believe this." Dad stood frozen, his lips pressed in a hard line. Michael kept his head down, shoulders trembling. Mom sobbed into a napkin. I walked toward the door, the weight of years pressing against my back. My hand touched the knob, the murmur of stunned relatives behind me. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I opened the door, the cold December air rushing in, sharp and clean. Without looking back, I stepped outside, leaving the glow of the Christmas tree, and the silence of my family behind me. The silence after that Christmas lasted longer than I expected. Days passed, then weeks with no frantic calls, no desperate requests for money. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz at all hours. It felt strange, almost eerie, as if a constant storm had suddenly lifted and left only quiet air behind. When I did hear news, it came secondhand. Richard had taken a job with a construction company in Aurora, no longer his own boss, just another worker on someone else's crew. The man who once bragged about being the head of Carter Builders now carried another man's toolbox and collected a smaller paycheck. His voice, when I overheard it through Mom's speakerphone once, sounded thinner, less certain. Mom picked up extra shifts at the grocery store. She started clipping coupons, buying store brands instead of the expensive labels she once insisted on. When the mortgage weighed too heavy, they finally put the Naperville house on the market. The for sale sign went up that spring, and by summer the only home I had known growing up was sold. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the train tracks, the ceilings low, and the walls painted an unforgiving beige. Michael, meanwhile, unraveled further before he began to climb back. Sarah filed the final divorce papers, and Jacob went to live with her temporarily. Left alone, Michael checked himself into a rehab program after one too many nights, ended with him passed out on a stranger's couch. For months, he stayed in treatment, emerging thinner, quieter. Eventually, he found work in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of job where the hours are long, the pay is minimum, and the recognition non-existent. I kept my distance. I didn't drive out to see them on weekends, didn't answer every call. The only conversations I allowed were with Mom, and even those were brief. She updated me in snippets. How Richard's hands ached from long days. How Michael was sober for 30 days, then 60, then 90. I listened, my responses polite but careful. I was not going back. Then one night, my phone rang, Mom's number, glowing across the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something inside told me to answer. Her voice was uneven, thick with tears. "Emily," she whispered, "I need to say something. You were never the black sheep. Never. You were the strongest one of us. And I let them make you feel like you were less." I sat in silence, my throat tight, the city lights flickering outside my window. "I'm so sorry," she continued. "Sorry for every time we pushed you aside, every time we erased what you did. You carried us when we didn't deserve it. And when you finally said no, it was the first time we were forced to grow up." Her sobs filled the line, raw and heavy. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, closing my eyes, letting the words sink in. For years, I had dreamed of hearing an acknowledgement, even if only once, that I wasn't wrong for being different, for standing up, for cutting the cord. And now, as my mother cried and confessed what I had always known deep down, I felt the ache in my chest loosen. The words I had waited decades for finally came through the static of that late-night call. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the backbone. By 2025, my life looked nothing like the one I had imagined on those nights when I lay awake, calculating every dollar I had given away. The weight was gone, replaced by a steadiness I had built myself. I woke up each morning in the condo Daniel and I shared in downtown Chicago, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor, the hum of the city rising beneath us. It wasn't just a place. It was ours, paid for with my work, my choices, my freedom. Daniel proposed one quiet Saturday morning. We were standing in the kitchen, coffee brewing, eggs sizzling on the stove. He set down the spatula, turned to me with a small velvet box in his hand, and said simply, "I don't want to build a life without you. No audience, no spectacle, just two people who had weathered storms and wanted to face whatever came next together." I said yes with tears streaming down my face, laughing as the toast burned. At work, I had been promoted to senior analyst managing projects I once only dreamed of. My name carried weight in meetings, my opinions valued. The paycheck was generous, but more than that, it was mine. I no longer bled money into a void of ungrateful hands. Every deposit was a reminder that I had chosen myself. Back in Naperville, things had changed too. Richard had learned humility the hard way. His job with the construction company was steady but unremarkable. The man who once puffed up his chest bragging about contracts now came home with sore shoulders and dirt under his nails. The pride in his voice had softened. For the first time in my life, I heard something that almost sounded like respect when he spoke to me. Mom seemed lighter. She still worked part-time at the grocery store, but without the constant pressure of covering Michael's chaos, she started taking evening classes at the community center. She told me once during a phone call that learning something new at her age felt like reclaiming herself. I believed her. Michael had finally begun to face himself. Rehab had stuck. He was sober, working long shifts at the warehouse, and for once showing up when Jacob needed him. Jacob split time between Michael and Sarah, and while it wasn't perfect, it was stable. I saw my nephew one weekend at Mom's apartment, and he looked healthier, brighter. He hugged me fiercely, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to scoop him up out of despair. I saw hope in him. Walking through Millennium Park one evening, hand in hand with Daniel, I thought about the long road that had brought me here. The shame, the anger, the years of being erased. My father's words, black sheep, had once cut so deeply I thought I'd never stop bleeding. Now they felt different. If being a black sheep meant refusing to carry the burdens of others while they called me selfish, then yes, I was one. If it meant setting boundaries, demanding respect, and choosing my own happiness over their illusions, then I would wear the name proudly. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the strongest one in the room, and I had finally stepped out of the shadows. The skyline glittered above us, the city alive with possibility. Daniel squeezed my hand and I smiled, breathing in the crisp night air. For the first time in decades, my life was mine alone, not parceled out in wire transfers and secret sacrifices. If you've ever been dismissed or called the outsider in your own family, if you've ever had to fight to prove your worth, you know how heavy that silence can feel. I hope my story reminds you that stepping away isn't weakness. It's survival. Tell me, have you ever been made to feel like the black sheep in your family? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to know how you found your strength. And if my journey resonated with you, stay with us here. Because there are more stories to tell, and no one deserves to carry their burden alone.